Hello all, welcome to a new edition of Euroquestions, our bi-monthly webinars where we present the Jacques Delors Institute's research and analyze European news. Today we have decided to focus our session on the creation of new own resources for the European Union. Indeed, the debt generated by the COVID recovery plan labeled Next Generation EU has raised anew the need for new resources for the European budget. In 2020, when the recovery package was adopted, the three EU institutions agreed on a detailed roadmap for the progressive introduction of various new financial resources before 2026. This roadmap included the creation of 3 additional own resources, which will be detailed by our speaker today. I'm delighted to welcome Eulalia Rubio, Senior Researcher in European Economic Affairs here at the Jacques Delors Institute. She will give us a progress report on the implementation of the roadmap for the introduction of new own resources. She will also discuss the prospects of success and examine possible avenues of action in the future. Before handing over the floor to our speaker, I remind you that the Q&A tool is available at the bottom of your screen. It will enable you to ask all your questions, which I will relay to our speaker in the second part of this 30-minute webinar. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Eulalia Rubio for her presentation.
Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you to all. I will try to be as short as possible, even if it's a bit technical issue, actually, what we are going to deal today. Let me start by saying that, well, the reform of the system of EU own resources is nothing new. It's an issue that has been a long-standing item in the EU agenda for many years. And actually, the Commission has several times, every MFF negotiation, the 3 latest MFF negotiations, every time the Commission has proposed the introduction of new own resources, but the idea has never received the consensus from the member states. And as we know, any reform from the system of own resources requires the unanimity of member states. The reason behind many people want to reform the system of own resources, including the Commission and also the Parliament, because it's one of the permanent requests from the Parliament, is that there is this perception, this overall consensus, I would say, that the dominance of the national contributions, what we call the GNI-based resource, that is contributions made by member states based on their wealth, on the GNI, creates some problems. And basically what it makes is that it fuels member states' tendency to look at how much do they pay for the EU budget and how much do they receive. And therefore they overlook a bit the benefits, the aggregate benefits of EU spending. So that's something that we have seen several times, attempts to try to introduce new own resource, but fail all the time. And actually the last big reform was in the late 80s, so it's a long time ago. But now we have a new and powerful argument actually to create new own resources, that is, as Mathieu has said, this need to repay the NGU debt. When it was created, the Next Generation EU in 2020, we decide, or the institutions decide, that we will pay back all this debt before 2068. To be more precise, actually the current EU budget, the MFF that lasts until 2027, will have some cost, the cost of refinancing, the payment of some interest. But this is already covered because there was a budgetary line created for that. So we don't have to worry about that. But from 2027 until 2068, we'll have to reimburse the capital of the current component of this debt, because actually there is more or less probably half of this big EU debt that we have raised because to respond to the COVID crisis is going to be used in form of loans, and half is going to be used in form of grants. The loan part, it will be reimbursed normally by the member states that benefits from these loans, and the grant part we have to pay it back together. And this will amount more or less to 15 billion per year. So we need 15 billion per year from 2028 on to start paying back this back. And if we do not have extra revenues to pay this back, that we will be confronted to a dilemma. We will have either to increase national contributions to future EU budgets or to cut EU spending programs to give, to cover this gap in payments. So that's why it is important to start working on that. And as Mathieu already said, that was something that was already very were in the minds of the EU institutions when they decided this big package, MMF recovery package in 2020. You will remind that the big, historical European Council was in July 2020, where EU member states decide the NGU debt, the NGU instrument. But then in December 2020 was when this was agreed with the Parliament together with the MFF. And it was at that time that the Parliament, on the request of the Parliament, actually, the three institutions agreed on a, let's say, binding roadmap or calendar to introduce different own resources. I say binding a bit between brackets because it is binding in the sense that members, the three institutions are engaged to do efforts to introduce these new own resources. But in the end, the introduction of new own resources will depend on whether or not there is an agreement under unanimity in the Council at the moment of voting these new proposals of own resources. And this roadmap basically is divided in 3 steps. The first step was in 2021. There was already the introduction of a very tiny contribution, new own resource based on the volume of non-recycled plastic waste, but that's something that was already agreed in the package, in the MFF recovery package. The most important thing in the first step was this engagement from the Commission to propose a first basket of new own resource, which had to be based on three elements: the ETS, the new carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the creation of a new EU digital tax. That was the agreement taken at the moment of deciding the roadmap. The second step is where we are now. Now we have already the proposal of the Commission on the table. And the idea was that, according to this roadmap, the Council had to decide, or has to decide, in July of this year about these proposals put forward by the Commission, in view of the entry into force of these new own resources by January 2023. And then there is a third step that was already foreseen, that is a second basket of own resources that is expected, according to this roadmap, again, it's expected by June 2024, and which may include the financial transaction tax, which is already in the pipeline for a long time. It has been discussed in the for a long time, and a new contribution linked to the corporate sector. Now, this roadmap has been more or less respected, but there have been some deviations from the original roadmap. Why it has been so? Because at the moment when the Commission had to propose the first basket of own resources in June 2021, there was one problem that blocked the proposal of the Commission, which was that at the same time there was the negotiation of this big international agreement, OECD G20 agreement on corporate taxation. And there was a problem at that time was the US, the United States that were participating in this big OECD agreement, did not see in good eyes the fact that the Commission was going to propose a new digital tax, because it was seen as incompatible with what it was under negotiation in this big agreement. I will enter into detail later on if you want, but basically the new agreement was going to resolve this problem of basically big US digital giants, the GAFA, the so-called GAFA, the fact that they do not pay enough taxes in market jurisdictions in which they operate, because they pay most of the taxes in the country of origin. That was one of the things that was going to be resolved by this big OECD agreement. And the EU digital tax in some ways was conceived as a GAFA tax, was also going to address this problem. So it was a doubling of, it was going to be 2 instruments to attack the same problem. So in the end, after much hesitations, the Commission decided to postpone the presentation of this first basket of own resource after the signature of this big OECD agreement that took place in October 2021. And therefore, the first basket of own resources was presented in December 2021. That was called, these names, nice names that the Commission used, was called the Next Generation EU Own Resource Proposals. And as you see in the slide that I have taken from the presentation of the Commission, there was it includes 3 new own resources. The 2 ones that were already in the calendar, in the roadmap, the one based on ETS, on the reform ETS, another one based on the new carbon border adjustment mechanism, and a third one that was a substitute of this EU digital tax, which is a non-resource based on the so-called Pillar 1 of this new OECD agreement. I will detail it later on, but basically the Commission wait until the agreement was done at the international level on how to tax big corporates, and then propose a non-resource based on one part of this big agreement. Before entering into the details of the three on-resources proposed, one thing, a common denominator of the three of them, and I think it's important to say it, is that in the three cases, we are talking about on-resources created on tax basis that still doesn't exist, actually. In the three cases, we are still negotiating the tax base on which this new on-resource have to be created. We are still under negotiation of the new ETS, the reformed ETS. And today, precisely this morning, there has been a failure of the parliament to adopt a position on that. The same has happened with the SEBAM. So the SEBAM is a new mechanism proposed by the Commission, but still we do not have an agreement on that. And as for the OECD agreement, there has been this big signature in October 2021, but we still need some further steps taken by the OECD to implement this agreement. And before these steps are not taken, we cannot create this on-resource. So let's see one by one this new on-resource proposed by the Commission. The ETS on-resource, what the Commission proposed is to use 25% of revenues from ETS 1, the traditional ETS that we have now, enlarged to the maritime and the aviation sector. And the new ETS, what is called ETS 2, that is the new carbon market created for transports or proposed by the Commission to be created for transports and buildings. So the proposal of the Commission is to reserve 25% of the world revenues of these two ETS for the budget in form of on-resource. And this, the proposal of on-resource is also accompanied by the creation of a social climate fund, which is intended to mitigate the negative impact of carbon prices on transports and buildings. And the Commission proposed to finance this social climate fund with a budget equivalent to 25% of ETS2 revenues. That's the proposal of on-resource plus global social climate fund. Where do we stand as regards to these negotiations? Well, as I said just some minutes ago, today the European Parliament had to vote on the reform of the ETS and the social climate fund. And the latest information we have is that this vote has failed. So we still do not have a position from the European Parliament on that. And we do not have neither a position from the Council. So we are a bit late or a bit far from having a final agreement on this ETS. And therefore, as I said, since we do not have, until we do not have the tax base, we cannot even envisage that the Council start to negotiate the on-resource on the basis of this tax base. There are some open issues. There are many open issues on the negotiation of the ETS, and I will not enter into detail. It's not the focus of these Euroquestions, but there are two issues maybe that have a direct implication for the on-resource decision or negotiation. One is the final scope of this ETS2, which is under discussion. The Parliament, or at least the vote in the committee in the Parliament, proposed to restrict ETS2 at the beginning to commercial buildings, and then later on maybe opening up to private buildings. And if it is approved in the end, that will mean that the base will be a bit reduced, at least temporarily. But we don't know what will be the final position on that from the Council and the Parliament. And the other issue that has implications for the ETS on-resource is the question of the timing or the calendar to phase out ETS free allowances. That is something that is part of the CBAM negotiations. So at which rhythm we will phase out these free allowances given to certain industries that now they enjoy from this from being exempted from the ETS. But with the CBAM, it makes sense to put them into the system. And again, depending on the calendar, whether we take more or less time, well, the tax base of the ETS will be reduced or increased accordingly. The CBAM on-resource, what is proposed by the Commission is to use 70, so the member states will receive the revenues, will collect the revenues of this new mechanism, this carbon burden adjustment mechanism, that is, just to remind some people in the audience, is this mechanism that is going to tax imports from third countries so that to make them pay the equivalent in carbon costs that we apply to our market, to the producers in our market, in certain sectors, only in the most carbon-intensive sectors. So the idea is that member states will collect these revenues, but 75% of these revenues are going, according to the Commission's proposal, will be used to finance the EU budget in form of own resource. Where do we stand as regards the negotiation? Well, again, the vote today, the Parliament was voting on CBAM, but it has failed the vote. And as regards the Council, we have a partial agreement, but still not final agreement on this new instrument. The open issues on CBAM, apart from the question of phasing out ETS free allowances, from the point of view of own resources, one thing that is very important is that to be compatible with WTO rules, with the World Trade Organization rules, this new instrument has to be seen as a climate instrument and not as an instrument to raise revenues, actually. And to make this happen, we have trade experts say that we need to use CBAM revenues or an equivalent amount to support decarbonization in these developed countries that are affected by this instrument. So far, I mean, the Parliament, what the Parliament proposed or has proposed so far is to maintain the own resource based on CBAM, but create a parallel budget for this equivalent to the CBAM revenues to accomplish with this requirement. But we don't know what will be the final agreement between the Parliament and the Council on this issue. And third own resource, which is this own resource based on Pillar 1 of the OECD G20 agreement. What is the Pillar 1? I mean, just to summarize a bit, this big agreement is based on two pillars, Pillar 2, Pillar 1. Pillar 2 is the maybe most known one, is this one that is about putting a minimum tax rate of 15% to all big multinationals. Big multinationals being those who have an annual turnover of more than 750 million, so big but not very, very big. That's Pillar 2, and now we are trying to transpose it into a directive at the EU level. Pillar 1 is different. Pillar 1, the scope is more narrow, is only focused on the largest and most profitable multinationals, around 100 multinationals in the world that have an annual turnover of more than 20 billion. And more than 10% of profitability, and that includes, of course, the big US digital giants, GAFA, the so-called GAFA. And Pillar 1, what it makes is to put common rules on how to distribute taxing rights on the profits of these multinationals, precisely to correct this problem that we were saying, that these GAFA and these big multinationals, they pay the taxes in their country of origins, but they make a lot of profit in other market jurisdictions. What the Commission proposed is to build an own resource on the residual profit that will be allocated to member states following this Pillar 1. So thanks to this Pillar 1, member states will receive an additional profit they can tax. 15% of this additional profit they can tax, it has to be entered into the EU budget as form of own resource. Where do we stand as regards this Pillar 1 on resource? As I said before, the entry into force of Pillar 1 is not automatic. We signed the big agreement in October 2021, but to put into place this Pillar 1, we need the signature and ratification of a multilateral convention that details in more granularity these common rules on how to distribute these taxing rights. This is currently prepared by the OECD, but is still not open to signature and ratification. And apart from that, after that, we'll have to transpose it through a new directive. Which are the open issues as regards this Pillar 1 on resource? Well, we are already on delay for the signature and ratification of this multilateral convention. According to the original agreement, the OECD had this open to signature already early this year, and we are still under preparation of this multilateral convention. But most worrying maybe is the question of a big question mark that what will happen with the US midterm elections. If there is a major change in the political color of the US Congress, that might complicate the ratification of Pillar 1, because we shall remember maybe that this multilateral convention requires qualified majority in the US Congress to be ratified. And since this is let's say the Pillar 1 is the pillar that is less acceptable, let's say, for the US point of view. So the US, I mean, Pillar 2 is something that the US is very happy to have, but Pillar 1 is the one that detracts revenues for the US administration, that might pose a problem for the ratification of Pillar 1. So just to summarize, overall, how much of these three own resources will report? Well, the big, let's say, problem is that they will not report much, actually. If we take the estimates of the commissions, which were made at the beginning and did not take into account all this possible areas that I have been describing for each of these three own resources that may reduce the tax base of each of these own resources. So we take the most positive estimate, we'll have around 17.3 billion of revenues. As I say, we need 15 billion to pay back the debt, but we have to take into account, we have to subtract the cost of financing the social climate fund, which is already 8 billion per year. And of course, we will have to subtract if we want to make, the CBAM own resource WTO compatible. We have also to subtract this cost of, helping these developed countries in the effort to decarbonize. That's why it is very important to think already forward and to think on the second basket of own resources. The good news here is that the Commission has already announced that they will propose the second basket of own resource a bit earlier, not in 2024, but in 2023. And we know more or less what there will be in this second basket. And as announced in the roadmap, there will be, again, the financial transaction tax. That, as I said, it's something that is in the pipeline already, but it creates a lot of, it has been subject to a lot of difficulties and is already negotiated under enhanced cooperation. So there is an opposition from certain member states to such type of tax. And then more interesting, there is this idea of creating a new own resource based on the corporate sector. And the Commission will build that on this new proposal, BEFIT proposal, that will be presented in 2023, which is basically the idea of building on the OECD agreement, improving it, completing it, to create a sort of, tax rule box, single tax rule box for corporate sector in Europe, which allow us to create an own resource on top of that. I stop here because otherwise it's already time, and I think it's nice to have some questions, but of course I'm open to discussion or to provide more details also on the BEFIT proposal or other aspects of the presentation.
Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I'm going to delve straight away into questions. Questions we're getting from a few participants today is what will happen if one or two of these projects for new own resources fail? Does that mean potential more contributions from member states directly? And what would be the consequences of that for the European Union in the future and our economic health?
Yeah, well, it may happen that one of these own resources fail, but the only thing it will happen is that we will try to adopt, or the Council will try to adopt the remaining two, and we will have less resources in the short term. So the second basket of own resources will have to be even more ambitious, actually, to fill the gap. Otherwise, we'll have still a gap in 2028 to fill. That's the immediate consequence in the case of the revenues from the first basket of own resources are less important than we foresaw.
Thank you very much. Another question a bit linked that we're getting is in the eventuality of a second recovery plan, which has been a second next generation plan, which has been mentioned since a year, a bit more now. Is that something that is likely today, a second plan, and is it something that is conditional to the adoption of these new own resources?
Well, that's a very difficult question that goes beyond the question of own resources. I think it's likely to see the debate, a serious debate on the need of a second plan. It is not likely, or at least it will be difficult to have an agreement to put into place the second plan, but it may happen because, of course, in times of crisis as today, everything is possible. But we know that many member states adopted the first plan as a one-off instrument in a very historical moment, and they will not be easily convinced to create a second one. So we'll need very strong arguments for that. I do not think that the lack of own resource will block or will create an obstacle to this the creation of this one or the second one, because ultimately we can always I mean, creating a debt, we can always reimburse this debt with national contributions later on. And it might even if we don't have this new own resource, it might even be interesting to, to postpone in the time the expenditures if we are in face of a big crisis that increase the expenditure needs of the EU. It is still interesting maybe to create a debt, even if we are going to, we have to pay it back through own contributions from the member states. So it makes still sense, but it would be much better for the credibility of the union to create own resources on a more permanent basis to make sure that, I mean, in front of investors, to give this signal that we are autonomous and we do not depend on, because but in any case, increasing the budget or increasing national contributions, always we will be confronted to this unanimity problem. So it's a good thing if we have new own resources that work, let's say, automatically in some sense and report some resources to the EU budget without having to have all these political votes always.
Thank you very much. Another question is to go back a bit on this. So the OECD plan for a global minimum level of taxation for multinationals. So you mentioned that member states would be held to given 15% of this tax benefit to the EU budget. So why do we still call that an own resources? Is it not a form of indirect own resource? And another question pertaining to that is, does that not create a situation where certain member states would disagree in handing over this 15% of their profit to the European Union?
Yeah, well, let me correct, because there is a misunderstanding actually. The 15% minimum tax is what we call the second pillar of the OECD agreement. What the Commission proposed is to create a non-resource on the first pillar of the OECD agreement. These are not totally different, but these are different things. The second pillar, the logic is to create a level playing field in the whole, so that all national jurisdictions tax at minimum 15% big firms. And big firms are not very big firms. Big firms are just big firms that have an annual turnover of 750 million. So it's not, they don't have to be giant firms. That's the second pillar. The second pillar, we have to each jurisdiction that has signed the OECD agreement has to transpose into domestic law. And in the case of the EU, we have to do it through a directive. And it's a directive that is now being negotiated and maybe will be voted in the ECFIN Council of June. The first pillar is different. The first pillar, the scope is much reduced. It's only on these 100 very big multinationals, the big winners of globalization in the end. I mean, the ones that really make a lot of profit everywhere in the world. And the idea is not to make a minimum tax for these multinationals, but to distribute the taxing rights over their profits. Because the problem here is that these multinationals make profit everywhere in the world by selling services and goods, but they pay their taxes only in the country of origin. And therefore you have some member states, some countries that profit a lot from these multinationals, which are the countries of origin, namely the US, because many of them are in the US. Whereas the other ones, I mean, even if the economic activity is made in their markets, they cannot tax these big multinationals. So pillar one is not minimum taxation, is how to distribute taxing rights on the profit of these multinationals. And is on this pillar one that the Commission wants to put an own resource. This pillar one will make that member states will receive an extra amount of money, because most of these multinationals are American multinationals. And now with the new rules of pillar one, part of the profits of these multinationals will correspond to each member state to tax these profits. So they will have an extra revenue thanks to this pillar one. The idea of the Commission is to say 15% of this extra revenue, thanks to pillar one, has to be used to finance the EU budget. That's the own resource based on pillar one. This is different, as I said, to pillar two. Probably what the Commission will do in the second basket of own resource is to create an own resource based on BEFIT. And BEFIT is an adaptation of pillar one and pillar two for the European market. And there you will have, this pillar two and pillar one together. So you will have a system by which the Commission can tax on more at the European level, based on a minimal taxation of 15% for all firms, not only the multinationals, but also domestic big firms, and based on a system to distribute taxing rights of multinationals operating in Europe. Not only these very big ones, but minor multinationals. That's the idea of BEFIT, actually, to build on the philosophy of the OECD agreement, but to apply it to all big firms in Europe, and on the basis of that, to create an own resource. But this will be the second basket, to be clear.
Thank you very much. So time goes by very fast, but I wanted to leave you with one last question. It's a very large question, but I thought it really interesting. So a participant is asking, new own resources will mean new tax for the European people, and it's a question.
No, I don't think so, because I mean they're full of criteria to identify optimal new own resources, and that there's a huge literature on what would be an optimal own resource for the EU level. But one thing that is repeated and is always taken into account is that own resources normally are put on top of national resources and never in a way to detract resources for the national level. And if you see these new own resources that are proposed, or all, as I say, all are based on new tax bases. I mean, we are not taking national resources from the national level. Even for the ETS, there is an increase in the coverage of ETS. So far, the ETS revenues went to the member states, but now we are also increasing the pie. So it's part of these revenues will go to the EU level, but the pie is bigger than before. So it's a hidden argument that is always very much carefully taken into account when proposing new resources, that this does not have to be in to detract national revenues, because otherwise that makes no sense actually.
And on the question of having these new resources impact directly citizens, what is your take on that? I'm thinking, for example, opening ETS to private
well,
buildings.
That's a big question, actually. I mean, and that has made, it must be said, that has made some of these proposals of own resource quite unpopular amongst many people, because, for instance, many people with a climate sensitivity, rightly so, they have said, well, it's much more important to use, the revenues of climate taxation to help people that are harmed by this climate taxation. So we have to be very careful on that. And it's true that if we create an ETS2 for this road and transport sectors in which the elasticity of the market is not very big, so there will be people very much harmed by this increase of carbon prices. If we want to keep on resources on ETS, which I think it is important also for the sake of credibility, because as you have seen in one of the slides, the ETS resource represents 75% of the total first basket of resources. So we cannot. I mean, it will give a very bad signal if we eliminate this on resource. But if we want to keep this on resource, which is important, then we have also to commit to put extra funds in the EU budget to help people that will be affected by this carbon price. So I think we have to be careful, especially when we create on resources that are based on climate objective, not to create things that are a bit against the just transition, actually, because otherwise we'll have a backlash also. If the EU is taxing or is seen as one of the actors that is making increase the price of energy, that's not a good thing neither. So it's a delicate balance, but it has to be taken seriously, actually.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation and having taken the time to answer all of these questions. Before we close this session, I'd like to remind you that you can find all of Eulalia Rubio's publications on the Jacques Delors Institute's website. I'd like also, we talked about the ETS on this last question. Our researcher Camille Defar works more specifically on the topic of ETS, and you can find her publications online. Regarding the carbon border adjustment mechanism, our sister institute in Brussels, Europe Jacques Delors, publishes on that topic as well. So we encourage you to follow us on our different platforms, social media, and our mailing lists that you can subscribe to online. The next session for Euroquestions will be held in French, and that will be on the June 22nd with our president, Enrico Letta. who will make us the pleasure to be with us, and we will discuss with him ahead of the 23rd and 24th European Council Summit. That's 24th and 23rd and 24th of June. Sorry, and we will talk with him about the different topics that will be addressed in this summit. So the situation in Ukraine, the end of the conference on the future of Europe, and different topics mainly regarding European external policy. He will give us all his takes on that. Thank you again, Eulalia Rubio, and until next time.